Is sugar toxic?
I believe it is.
Dr. Robert Lustig is a pediatric endocrinologist at the University of California, San Francisco, and a pioneer in what is becoming a war against sugar.
What are all these various diseases that you say are linked to sugar?
Obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease itself. 75% of it is preventable.
It was his lecture on YouTube called Sugar, the Bitter Truth, that brought his message to the masses.
I'm standing here today to recruit you in the war against bad food.
By bad food, Dr. Lustig means the obvious things, such as table sugar, honey, syrup, sugary drinks, and desserts. But also just about every processed food you can imagine, where sugar is often hidden. Yogurts and sauces, bread, even peanut butter. And what about the man-made, often vilified sweetener, high fructose corn syrup? Since the 1970s, sugar consumption has gone down nearly 40%. But high fructose corn syrup has more than made up the difference. But as sugar and high fructose corn syrup became cheaper to refine and produce, we started gorging on them. Americans now consume 130 pounds per person a year. Dr. Lustig believes those sweeteners are helping fuel an increase in the most deadly disease in America. But now studies done by Kimber Stanhope, a nutritional biologist at the University of California, Davis, are starting to back him up. She's in the middle of a groundbreaking 5-year study which has already shown strong evidence linking excess high fructose corn syrup consumption to an increase in risk factors for heart disease and stroke. Stanhope has paid groups of research subjects to live in this hospital wing for weeks at a time, under a sort of 24-hour lockdown. For the first few days, participants eat a diet low in added sugars, so baseline blood levels can be measured. Then 25% of their calories are replaced with sweetened drinks, and Stanhope's team starts drawing blood every 30 minutes around the clock. And those blood samples?
And what are you starting to see?
We found that the subjects who consumed high fructose corn syrup had increased blood levels of LDL cholesterol and other risk factors for cardiovascular disease.
How quickly did these changes occur?
Within 2 weeks.
Kimber Stanhope's study suggests that when a person consumes too much sweet stuff, the liver gets overloaded with fructose and converts some of it into fat. Some of that fat ends up in the bloodstream and helps generate a dangerous kind of cholesterol called small dense LDL. These particles are known to lodge in blood vessels, form plaque, and are associated with heart attacks. So imagine, for these healthy young people, drinking a sweetened drink might be just as bad for their hearts as the fatty cheeseburgers we've all been warned about since the 1970s.
Time to reduce fat in the American diet.
Exactly. And we did. And guess what? Heart disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and death are skyrocketing. When you take the fat out of the food, it tastes like cardboard. Food industry knew that. So they replaced it with sugar.
This idea that sugar increases this particularly bad LDL. Do most doctors, do they know this?
No, they do not know this. So this is new.
Cantley, a Harvard professor and the head of the Beth Israel Deaconess Cancer Center, says when we eat or drink sugar, it causes a sudden spike in the hormone insulin, which can serve as a catalyst to fuel certain types of cancers. Why? Nearly a third of some common cancers, including breast and colon cancers, have something called insulin receptors on their surface.
So if you happen to have a tumor that has insulin receptors on it, then it will get stimulated to take up the glucose that's in the bloodstream. So rather than going into the fat or the muscle, the glucose now goes into the tumor, and the tumor uses it to grow.
So you've just seen that tumor turn blue, which is essentially reflective of the glucose going into it.
Yes, so they have evolved the ability to hijack that flow of glucose that's going by in the bloodstream into the tumor itself.
Louis Cantley's research team is working on developing drugs that will cut off the glucose supply to cancer cells and keep them from growing. But until there's a breakthrough, Cantley's advice, don't eat sugar. And if you must, keep it to a minimum. Eric Stice, a neuroscientist at the Oregon Research Institute, is using functional MRI scanners to learn how our brains respond to sweetness. Eric Stice says by scanning hundreds of volunteers, he's learned that people who frequently drink sodas or eat ice cream or other sweet foods may be building up a tolerance, much like drug users do.
Ultimately, this is a public health crisis. And when it's a public health crisis, you have to do big things and you have to do them across the board. Tobacco and alcohol are perfect examples. We have made a conscious choice that we're not going to get rid of them, but we are going to limit their consumption. I think sugar belongs in this exact same wastebasket.